Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday, and it is the 23rd day of July in the year 2019. It is a pleasure to be with you again on this Tuesday. It's also very good to hear from Bob. I like to go back and forth between Bob and Agnes. Kind of keep in touch with both of them, and I really enjoy. I never know which one of them is going to be on the other end when I call in. So, and it's always a pleasure, whichever one it happens to be. So, thanks, Bob, and I hope everybody is doing well today on the day before Robert Mueller's testimony. That's going to be consuming public attention tomorrow, no question. Chatted with Bob at before we went on the air today about our program tomorrow, and whether in fact I was raising the question as to whether in fact there would be anybody listening, and what we concluded is so many people pick it up and rebroadcast anyway that maybe a good thing to do is to come on. I'll be watching the Mueller testimony up until showtime, as it were, and we can kind of, draw some initial conclusions even while it's going on. And so, if everything works right, we'll be here. I'll be here. And I trust that those who regularly tune in will be here with us as well. Please, again, let me encourage you to feel free to share your thoughts, your opinions with our other listeners by coming on the air. We have an 800 number, and if you call it, it'll get you into the studio, and Bob's there today, and he'll get you on the air immediately, and then that'll give you an opportunity to interact not only with me, but with our other listeners as well. The 800 number is 844-THE-HORN. So the number you would call, 844-THE-HORN. If you'd like to send me a comment directly to me, you can do that in one of two ways. You can either send me an email or comment to me through our Facebook page. If you'd like to send me an email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. If you find it more convenient to make your comment through the Facebook page, then that's very easy to do as well. Just go to our Facebook page, and the way you get there, and I think most people already know it, is to go to the homepage of Facebook, facebook.com, and you'll see a search box at the top of the page. And if you type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution in that search box, that'll take you to our Facebook page, and on it you'll see a number of postings that I've put on there, in recent weeks. And at the end of each posting, there are two computer links. There's a share link and a comment link. If you click on the share link, it sends that particular posting to all of your friends on your Facebook account. So if you are taken by a particular posting, whatever it might be, and want to share it with your friends, that's the way to do it. If you want to make a direct comment to me, just click on the comment link. And like an email, it'll give you an opportunity to direct a comment directly to me. And immediately when you post your comment, my Facebook account will tell me that a comment has been entered on one of the postings on our Facebook page, and then Facebook will take me directly to the posting and your comment. The presumption, of course, would be that your comment would be related to the posting. That makes obviously the most sense. But since I'll be reading every comment, it doesn't matter whether in fact you follow that or not. If your comment relates to something totally different than the posting, and all you're doing is using a particular posting to get to the comment button, that's all right too, because I'll be able to tell that immediately once I start to read your comments. So the point is, we would love to hear from you, and we want to create as many different ways as we can to encourage interaction and back and forth exchange, especially since many of the things we're covering and will be covering, it seems to me, are controversial. They warrant discussion and reflection. That's the nature of the program. It's long been the nature of the program. And I want to make sure that it remains that way. So therefore, the more interaction there is, the more relevant the program is, and the more helpful to you our programs are. So that's really the point of the comment and the interaction and the reason for it. So I just kind of want everybody to know that if you are inclined through the program, during the program, to make a comment, then by all means feel free to do that. There are a couple of things before we get into anything of major pieces of substance in today's program. There were just a couple of things that I wanted to kind of bring to the fore or mention. In some ways, it would be remiss not to mention them, and in other cases, I don't want to just make this kind of a reading of the front page of the New York Times either, or Washington Post, or Boston Globe, or LA Times, whatever it might be. But there was a piece, an editorial, in the local West Virginia Gazette Mail this morning, and it referred to something that we've covered a couple of times here on the Virtual Center, and it caught my attention. And I didn't make a hard copy of the article because I don't want to devote too much time to it. But since it does relate to things to something that we've covered more than once, I thought it was worth mentioning to you. And it's the issue of model pieces of legislation. It was a research project that was done on the subject of model legislation, model bills, if you will. And what the research uncovered is that a vast majority of state legislatures, and this is a national survey, but a total analysis of legislation that is introduced into state legislatures, all 50 states, indicates that a significant portion of the legislation considered by state legislatures is legislation that has been drafted by a group or individuals outside the legislature. I think most of us assume that when we elect members of the legislature, people to represent us, that they go to the legislative session and they partner with other people in their party and they draft pieces of legislation for introduction to the and consideration in the legislature, that draft is from scratch. And if you think about it, that is a little bit illusory, because it stands to reason whenever you have to put anything together, people will usually go and look at one or two examples of what they have in mind before they do it, rather than just fumble around in the dark. So the fact of the matter is, what this research indicated was that a significant number of bills introduced in state legislatures come from what the survey referred to as model legislation, where particular groups send draft copies of proposed legislation, and they trust allies that they have in that particular legislature to take the bill and maybe adjust it to the particular state involved and then introduce it. And we talked about this here on the Virtual Center more than once, because we've talked oftentimes about the American Legislative Exchange Council, so-called ALEC, the conservative group that's funded by heavy hitters, the most prominent one being the Kochs. And that this organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is in the business of drafting model pieces of legislation for introduction into state legislatures. And over the last few years, more and more of those state legislatures are controlled by Republicans, which means that they are leaning conservative anyway, and they're much more receptive to these particular pieces of legislation. The best example that we've got here in West Virginia was the so-called Omnibus Education Bill, which was introduced into the spring session of our legislature. It didn't pass, but it did pass through the Senate and made it all the way to the floor of the House before it was revised significantly, and then ultimately was defeated. But there was a special session called this past summer on the issue of education, and education legislation was reintroduced in the special session. Importantly, it was pretty much the same legislation that had been defeated in the spring, but the title, the name of the bill, was changed. And it was included in the title was the idea of student success reform bill, an education student success reform bill. In reality, it was essentially the same bill that had been defeated earlier in regular session. And with a number of amendments, that bill passed. That bill was a model piece of legislation. It was crafted by the American Legislative Exchange Council and introduced into the legislature, went through the Senate, went through the House Education Committee. In fact, there was a change in leadership in the House Education Committee, Senate Education Committee. There was a change in leadership in the last minute before the legislation was introduced, because the person that had been chairing the Senate Education Committee was opposed to charter schools. And since that was the flagship item in this omnibus bill, the president of the Senate, Mitch Carmichael, replaced the chair of the Education Committee with a person who did support private schools and charter schools. She got on and started to chair the Education Committee, and the omnibus bill went right through to the full and onto the full Senate in a matter of a day or two. The details of this particular article in today's Charleston Gazette on this issue of model legislation, I think is kind of interesting. Between 2010 and 2018, in other words, the last 9 years, if you will, 4,000 pieces, 4,000 bills, examples of model legislation were introduced in state legislatures by conservative groups. 1,600 by liberal groups and particular issue lobbyists. Here in West Virginia, during that same period, 325 pieces of legislation were introduced, model legislation was introduced between 2010 and 2018. And two of the former members, Republican members of the House of Delegates, were kind of the leaders in introducing these model bills. Ron Walters introduced 38 specific pieces of legislation that entered the state this way, and Kelly Sabanya introduced 33. So what I'm suggesting is that these groups, like the American Legislative Exchange Group, are drafting legislation and then distributing them to their allies throughout state legislatures throughout the country. That's the way many of these bills get introduced and get through. Some of them are changed a bit to fit the particular situation of that state. But in research I've seen on individual pieces of legislation introduced this way, the similarities between one state and another are astounding. For example, right to work legislation. Right to work legislation, if you compare the states that have it, and there are many of them, you'll find that the similarities are striking. Ultimately, what it suggests is that the whole idea of right to work came from one of these think groups. In this case, a conservative group. So I thought that the particular information in this particular article this morning was very interesting. That more than 4,000 pieces of legislation have been introduced throughout the various states over the last several years, and they originated this way. They originated as model pieces of legislation submitted by advocates, not drafted by the legislators who are sitting there. And I think that's really important because it speaks to something, and that's the reason I mentioned this on the program today. It used to be when we were in school, grade school, and studied American government and talked about representatives and the responsibility of a representative, most of us were given the impression that the nature of our political system, which makes it so unique and so positive, is that in this society, unlike so many others, the people speak and government responds. The fact of the matter is, this legislation that arrives into a state this way is reversing that process. The legislation is bought into by the representatives and then sold to the constituents. And it seems to me an obvious reform needs to reverse that process back to the way it was originally intended to be. How many times do we hear that particular legislatures or Congress or whatever are pushing legislation that surveys tell us the vast majority of the people don't want? I'm specifically thinking of regulation on guns. There's no question that a significant portion of the American population wants some sort of registration of guns, some sort of sensible gun control legislation, and the legislatures don't move. So we have a specific example in that of a process that is supposed to work a certain way not working at all. And I think it really needs to be changed. And that's why I point to that particular article, because that particular article contains some numbers and some research which indicates how prominent this idea of model legislation coming into a state from outside the state is becoming. And it speaks to something, and this is a point that I think, you know, some of you listening probably have already thought of. It speaks to the nature of an informed electorate, it seems to me. The founders talked all the time about the importance of an elected citizen, of an educated citizenry, of an informed citizenry. We've talked about that so many times on this program. But the danger is, and the fact of the matter is, that there are too many things happening which indicate that governments at all levels don't really have that much faith in the information and the wisdom of the citizens. And I think we're seeing that right now with the Mueller report. Bob and I were chatting about this before we came on the air. And I think it's a significant factor. And what I mean by that is, if you discard all the conversation, all the talking about the Mueller report and about Mueller's appearance tomorrow and all the rest of it, and you look at it from in a very direct way, the fact of the matter is, the reason Mueller is testifying tomorrow, the reason Democrats wanted to bring him before Congress, before particular committees, is because the Mueller report has been out for 3 months now, and fewer than 1% of the population has read it or intends to read it. And the fact of the matter is, Democrats have adopted the strategy of bringing Mueller back principally because they know that the only way the people, the large majority of the people, are going to know what's in that report is if Mueller comes back and gets on television and reads it to them. And so tomorrow's entire day, it seems to me, it can be explained that way. There's all sorts of debates about whether Mueller will clarify things in the report or whether he'll go beyond the report. And it turns out that just yesterday, the Department of Justice sent a letter to Mueller in which the department laid out the guidelines for his testimony tomorrow. What he could talk about and what he couldn't. And many of the pundits last evening and today are focusing on that particular issue. The reality is that the only way that the public, the vast majority of the public, is going to know what's in that report is going to be determined to a large degree by what happens tomorrow. And so the questions as to whether Mueller will go beyond the report, and even though he says he won't, and the Department of Justice in the letter told him he better not. The reality is that even if Mueller sticks to the report 100%, it's still likely to hurt Trump if the questions are successful enough to bring out from Mueller the nuts and bolts of what's in that report. Because the fact of the matter is there's enough in the report to really hurt the president, to really raise questions about criminality and potential impeachment. And if all tomorrow's hearing does is get that out, it could have a significant impact on public opinion. I think most of us have seen the video of the woman who said that she gets her news exclusively from conservative television, she said. It probably means Fox News. And she had no idea that there was anything negative in the Mueller report about President Trump at all. She is a faithful listener to the news, she said, and nobody ever, in the news she watched, nobody ever said that there was anything negative in that report. So the implication of what she's saying is clear. And that is that the Department of Justice and the Attorney General specifically got out in front of that report, slowed its release so that the general public didn't have access to it for over a couple of weeks, and used that time to tell people what was in the report so that if they did have any idea that they were going to read it, basically they didn't have to. The president started to trump no collusion, no obstruction, et cetera, fully exonerated and all of this. And it's worked. And so the only way to counter that for Democrats is tomorrow's appearance by Robert Mueller. And my point is that if you think about it, and nobody is really, but if you think about it, what does that say about us? About the American population? About the so-called need to know and right to know? About the idea of an informed citizenry? It basically suggests that we've got serious problems. That we are too vulnerable because we're allowing people with their own agenda to interpret truth for us, to interpret the facts for us, because we don't have time or can't be expected, to be kind, or whatever the justification might be, to go after the details ourselves. And the fact of the matter is, if you think about it, our whole political system is kind of based on these kinds of assumptions. And so the traditional idea that we teach young children that our country is unique and wonderful because it's one of the few countries in the world where the people speak and government responds. The nature of our political system and its history tells us that the exact opposite is true. That the people's belief system is the product of what their elected representatives and political leaders tell them. And when you combine that with the inclination most people have to get their news from the same source, and therefore they never hear any other news except from those they trust, which means the political direction or inclination, if you will, conservative, liberal, whatever, that they trust. They never hear the other side. And so this lady never had any inkling that there was anything negative in the Mueller report. She thought it was 448 pages of total exoneration of the president. And so the fact of the matter is, I think this model legislation research speaks to the same thing. And it kind of tells us that we're allowing ourselves to become extremely vulnerable to political manipulation and persuasion. And, I think we've got to get more and more into the guts, into the nuts and bolts of some of the things that happen, and discuss them, interact with them, exchange opinions with other people on these particular issues. That's really the only way that we learn. I think it's extremely important, which is the reason that I wanted to bring it up. I wanted to mention one other thing before we go on. In encouraging people to send emails, to send me emails or comments on the Facebook page or whatever, or to call in, I try whenever I can to acknowledge receipt of emails related to the program. And I wanted to share with you that last evening I received an email from Taiwan, from Horst in Taiwan. And it was a pretty powerful email. And I told him that I was going to mention this on the air today, and I wanted to do it because Horst sent a link to an article which appeared early this week, which appeared yesterday, I believe. And it was on danger issues between China and Iran. And basically, the issue in discussion was this one. The United States, the Trump administration, has imposed sanctions on Iran, severe sanctions, and expects the rest of the world to abide by those sanctions. In other words, we don't want other nations doing business with Iran. We're trying to force Iran to the table, theoretically. I say that theoretically because Iran has already expressed the willingness to come to the table, and we haven't responded yet. And it's a little bit concerning to me that we haven't. But this past week, a Chinese-sponsored oil barge was stopped. And Iran was very angry about it. And so there was a bit of back and forth between China and Iran over the stopping of this particular tanker. And Horst's concern was that, and again, it's just a theory, but based on our programs, especially based on Kevin Shanley's appearance on our programs, in which he's talked so much about Taiwan and China and Hong Kong and North Korea and the rest. Horst began to see the makings of a possible conspiracy here. His concern was, it appeared that China was trying to push the U.S. and Iran into some sort of military conflict. And that China was doing everything it could to instigate hostility between Iran and the United States. And Horst's concern, since he lives in Taiwan, is very understandable, and Kevin Shanley told us about this. China still believes that Taiwan is part of China and refuses to accept the independence status of Taiwan. And Horst's concern is that if military action of some sort between the United States and Iran occurs that would create an opportunity for China to move on Taiwan, because the United States couldn't handle both. And so, as Horst phrased it, while the United States is focusing attention on the Straits of Hormuz, they're not going to be able to watch China as it moves to take the Straits of Taiwan. And he's beginning to see the possibility that this might be true. That in effect, China was almost baiting the United States into laying down the law, drawing red lines, if you will, in relations with Iran. And my response to him was that there are people around the president, and I spoke specifically of Secretary of State Pompeo and John Bolton. These two are on record for some time as believing that regime change in Iran is the only thing we can do that's going to end this. And so for a long time, they've advocated regime change in Iran. President Trump has said that he doesn't want war with Iran, but some people are beginning to speculate that he may not be able to resist. And this whole situation about the China oil business with Iran, Horst believes, is a segment of that whole story. It's very complicated, very confusing, and very dangerous. And I told Horst that I was going to mention it on the air today, and give him credit for it, because I think it's something all of us should watch very, very carefully. Of course, the fact of the matter is, I know it's difficult to watch everything, but in this particular case, I think it's to Mueller from the Department of Justice, and the Associate Attorney General is the one who signed the letter, not William Barr, but his immediate underling. The first thing, Bob and I were commenting on this. The important thing to note is that I got Barr in my mind. Robert Mueller himself requested this letter about a month ago. He basically sent a request to the Department of Justice and asked for guidance on what the rails were on his upcoming testimony to these congressional committees. And this letter was the response of the Justice Department. So he, in effect, wanted to know what the rules are, where he could go, what he could talk about, what he couldn't talk about. And this letter more than responded. So I think that's telling. I think it says that not only does Mueller's personality suggest that he's not going to wander away from what's written in the report, but it also indicates, since he's got guidance from the Department of Justice on his testimony tomorrow, he basically is looking for guidance as to what he can and cannot say. I think the result of that is going to be that many Democrats, at least the more optimistic ones about Mueller's testimony tomorrow, are going to be disappointed. You know, there's always, the first thing I thought of when I heard about the letter last night, before I knew it was solicited by him, the first thing I thought of is, whoa, if the Justice Department on the night before, 24 hours before he's scheduled to testify, is laying down the guidelines for him he's liable to just throw up his hands and really go off at the hearing tomorrow because of anger and frustration. But again, that's not like him. His whole career does not indicate that. But then when I found out that the letter was that he solicited the letter himself, it's very clear where he wants to go, what he wants to do, but more important, where he doesn't want to go and what he doesn't want to do. He doesn't want to play politics. He doesn't want to get into the Republican-Democrat hostility and controversy. And he's walking into a firestorm, and he knows it. By walking in there with these rules from the Department of Justice, it becomes, I think, in my mind, his justification for not responding to leading questions in tomorrow's hearings. So I think that people who have been anticipating this appearance with bated breath are probably going to end up somewhat disappointed. But as I mentioned earlier, if he does nothing but testify to the key ingredients of the report, that alone could do damage to the administration, because the entire administration position, which is no collusion, no obstruction, total exoneration, is depending on the ignorance of the general public. Mueller has the opportunity to dissipate a lot of that ignorance tomorrow. My concern is that he has to do this at all, because that doesn't speak well for the nature of the political system itself. We depend on the involvement, the informed, intelligent involvement of the general population. We don't get it naturally. I don't think anybody expects to get it, to get all of it. But our entire system depends on some of it. And I'm beginning to see that as the years go on, more and more people are willing to get their news from somewhere else. And with the internet and with cable, there are a lot of groups out there who are more than willing to interpret the news for you. And that's frightening, if you think about it. With that, I'd like to get back to some of the issues that we've been dealing with. I have in my hand, and this I'm referring back to yesterday's program, especially the second hour of yesterday's program, when we went into the issue of the Article 5 Constitutional Convention and Tom Hartman's piece on the number of states that have already signed on, and an indication as to how fast and far this movement to secure the calling of a constitutional convention has progressed. Also, I think it's significant, and this is kind of a summary of our second hour yesterday as a lead-in to going on. I think it's important to recognize that the push for an Article 5 convention has been going on for some time. But up until now, it's been focused on one issue, the Balanced Budget Amendment. But now, with these mock conventions being held at the instigation of this group called Citizens for Self-Governance, directed by Eric O'Keefe, who has connections to the Kochs and to conservative groups, it's very obvious now that this new group, Citizens for Self-Governance, once the Article 5 convention, if and when it does come into being, and it appears from everything we've seen that it has a good chance of doing that, to take on much more than just the balanced budget amendment. And specifically, Hartman refers to the September 2016 mock convention held in Williamsburg. It drew 137 delegates. Every state was represented. And the simulated convention passed 6 amendments, or 6 amendments. Term limits, restricting the scope of the Commerce Clause, limiting the power of the federal regulations, requiring that federal taxes be passed only with a supermajority, and that the 16th Amendment on the income tax be abolished, repealed, and that the states be given the power to override any federal law, regulation, or executive order. That menu would effectively neuter the Constitution of the United States. It would throw us back into something close to what we had under the Articles of Confederation. It would so weaken the federal government and strengthen the state governments that whoever controlled the state governments would be dictating national policy. And as we know, over the last several years, Republicans have been very successful in securing control of state legislatures and state houses. The Democrats made a dent of sorts this past November in the midterm elections. But the fact of the matter is, Republicans continue to control the majority of state legislatures. And when you look at what it would take to call an Article 5 convention, the request of 34 states, many of these states have already acknowledged their support for an Article 5 convention, and a number of states that haven't as yet are targeted, all of it contingent on the 2020 election. If Republicans are successful in holding on to the states they already have, or getting back states that they did have, or even securing control of states that they didn't have in 2020, then there would be enough states to constitute the 2/3 majority necessary for convening an Article 5 convention, and this would be the agenda. And these folks have already practiced, have already simulated conventions. They know exactly what they're going to do and how to do it once they're empowered to do it. And it all comes down to the 2020 election. And it just seems to me that while we focus on President Trump and the degree to which the 2020 election is going to be focused on Donald Trump, the fact of the matter is what's going on in the states is significant as well. And I think we'd be best served if we pay close attention to that. Because the irony of the situation is, on this particular issue, even if Trump doesn't win re-election, if Republicans are able to secure the control at the state levels that they hope to gain, then the Article 5 convention is off and running, if that makes sense. I think it's disturbing. I think it's challenging. And I think it's yet another reason why this particular election is going to be very, very significant, I believe, for all of us. That was the second hour we did yesterday, and I received a couple of comments on it and how frightening it is, and it is. I believe it is. There are a couple of other things going on that we haven't mentioned yet, and there has not been a lot of mention on this, but I think it's significant. And what alerted me to this was an article that appeared earlier this month on the 12th of July, a couple of weeks ago, and I've been walking around with it ever since, because the article, it's by Roger Cohen, who's a columnist, a regular columnist for, I believe, the New York Times. And Roger Cohen wrote this piece on the 12th, which was, I believe, a Friday, if I'm not mistaken, on a speech given by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that Monday, the Monday earlier, in which Pompeo announced the formation of a Human Rights Commission to examine, and these are Pompeo's words, which rights are entitled to respect. Pompeo said in his comments that the Trump administration, quote, takes seriously the founders' ideas of individual liberty and constitutional government. And so basically, it raises serious questions, it seems to me, about the whole issue of human rights. And I don't think it's coincidence. I think it's part of something very important. The first thing to keep in mind is that this particular commission that Pompeo is talking about is the creation of the U.S. State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights, is the official title of it. A thing to note, the State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights. What that means is that this doesn't refer just to rights within our country under our Constitution. This refers to the whole issue of human rights as part of American foreign policy. And that's exactly what Pompeo said in his remarks. He said the commission will conduct, quote, an informed review of the role of human rights in American foreign policy and report back to him with advice on human rights. I think I have here it is. A more substantive statement in Mike Pompeo's remarks. Modern human rights is really the topic here. And it raises serious questions. Because Pompeo raises the questions. He says, I hope that the commission will revisit the most basic questions. What does it mean to say or claim that something is, in fact, a human right? How do we know, or how do we determine whether that claim that this or that is a human right, is it true? And therefore, should it be honored? How can there be human rights rights we possess not as privileges we were granted or even earn, but simply by virtue of our humanity belong to us. Let me repeat that paragraph, because I think that this is extremely important. I hope that our commission will revisit the most basic of questions. What does it mean to say or claim that something is, in fact, a human right? How do we know, or how do we determine whether that claim that this or that is a human right, is it true and therefore ought it to be honored? How can there be human rights, rights we possess not as privileges we were granted or even earn, but simply by virtue of our humanity belong to us? In that paragraph, Pompeo is hitting on a very important idea or concept, and that is the whole idea of human rights. For the longest time, since the founding, we focused on the issue Jefferson referred to as unalienable rights. And in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, when he refers to unalienable rights derived from the Creator, he says among these are rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By defining these as unalienable, Jefferson is saying they don't come from government, they don't come from the king, they don't come from a president, they don't come from a legislature, they come from the Creator. That means that every living human being is entitled to these so-called unalienable rights, as distinguished from alienable rights. Alienable rights are rights that were given to you, rights that you could sign away or give away. For example, property. Property is measurable. Property can be assigned a monetary value. Property can be bought and sold and willed to your children. In other words, you can give it away. It is your possession. You own it. Since you own it and it is your possession, and you have a contract, a legal piece of paper, acknowledging that it is yours, that means that you're free to do with it what you will. That is to be distinguished from an unalienable right, which you can't give away. John Locke talks about that. He refers to them as natural rights. And that's why John Locke spends time on the issue of suicide. His argument is life itself is an unalienable right. It comes from God, which means that only God can end it, not you. That's the difference. Under the Constitution, we have a number of so-called civil rights. These are rights granted under our Constitution and deemed necessary to the functioning of the Constitution itself. Our entire system of government requires, for example, freedom of religion, free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, rights to a jury trial, and on and on and on. These are quite different from Jefferson's so-called unalienable rights. But over time, as society has developed, the world has developed, and the issue has kind of shifted into the whole idea of human rights. And what made human rights significant were the abuses the world experienced in World War I and World War II, principally the Holocaust. The assumption of abuse and torture and murder on a massive scale, efforts to eliminate an entire people, genocide, an entire group of people. And more, the world came out of World War II convinced that there needed to be international agreement on the existence of human rights. And the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which was passed in 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt was significant in moving that through the United Nations, talked about human rights that everybody has. Everybody is entitled to, by the mere fact that they are a human being, that they are alive. And ever since then, the emphasis has been on human rights. And since then, we've entered into the political discussion of late about health care and the degree to which many people believe health care is a human right, not a commodity, but a human right. Everybody is entitled to it. And that has modeled most developed governments on developing systems of universal health care. The only major developed nation that doesn't have a system of universal health care is us. Most developed nations operate on the assumption that access to health care is a human right, and that no matter who you are or how much you are worth, you are entitled to access to decent health care. And that's what Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and the others are talking about and pushing for. So now, and I'm thinking in 2016, Hillary Clinton during the campaign talked about women's rights as being a human right. And all of these are based on the idea that every human being deserves dignity, to be treated with dignity and respect. And that's really what we're talking about. So the issue is Pompeo's creation of an administrative commission to study the issue of unalienable rights. And it raises some questions, as that quote from Pompeo indicates. Because basically, he is raising questions about fundamental issues. What does it mean to say that something is a human right? How do we know, or how do we determine whether this or that is a human right? And is it true, therefore ought to be honored? How can there be human rights, rights which we possess not as privileges we were granted or earned, but simply by virtue of our humanity belong to us? It seems to many that the creation of this commission is driven by the idea of limiting the issue of human rights, or more definitively defining it in such a way that the vague claim of human dignity and all of these other things is not sufficient to warrant the acknowledgement of such and such an issue being a human right. I think this is extremely, extremely important. One of the people that Pompeo has put on the commission is Mary Ann Glendon. Mary Ann Glendon is a professor of law at Harvard. She's extremely controversial. She teaches about human rights. She's going to be the chair of the commission. She has a reputation already. In 2009, she was awarded a pro-life award by the National Right to Life. In that same year, Glendon turned down a medal from the University of Notre Dame because the university had given Barack Obama an honorary degree. She's going to be chairing this commission. It suggests that there's a very clear political component, an ideological component to this commission. And I think it's very significant that all of us basically are aware of that. And already there have been a number of commentaries about the dangers of this commission. Many people believe that it clearly has religious overtones because it smacks of the debate and the return of the idea of natural rights that haven't been used for a long time. Because what we've seen is a gradual transition from the idea, 18th century idea of natural rights or unalienable rights to the more universal idea of human rights. And it seems to many that this commission is an effort to move the clock back and work against the expanding idea of human rights. This is the idea, or this is what's bringing so many people to the southern border of this country, seeking asylum. This is what this nation in the world has been about, is to be a sanctuary for the oppressed. Coming here to seek security from potential abuse, crime, or violence has been recognized as a legal right. The right of people to escape violence, to protect themselves and their children. And we have to remember that this commission is coming into being in the face of what's happening on the southern border. And I think all of us need to take note and be aware. I've gone way over. It's 10 minutes after the hour into our second hour. I do want to pause and take a short break, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And then we'll be right back, and we'll still have better than 45 minutes left in our time together today. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to take a late pause, for a couple of minutes, give people a chance to get up and walk around, get a cold drink or whatever. So again, we'll be right back. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again, Dr. Bill Obrien. Who knows what happened there, but you're back, Dr. Bill.
Bob, I cut us off inadvertently.
Yay, for once it wasn't my fault.
I was
I'm
fooling
so
around.
proud.
I pushed the wrong button, for God's sake. I was gonna send you a message, and I pushed the hang up button instead of the message button.
Well, at least you're back.
Anyway, it's time. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
Oh, I love it.
Like I said, I feel like I got a little relief for once.
You did.
Wasn't on this end.
That's great.
Take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Welcome to this, our second hour. It's abbreviated. We're at almost 15 minutes after the hour. We're into our second hour. We still have 45 minutes left. So you're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm just going to quickly mention the 800 number, because please feel free to call in if you have something you'd like to say based on our first hour. We were talking about the creation of the State Department Commission on Unalienable Rights. I do believe that that's a significant issue. And if you have thoughts on it or issues that you think would contribute to an overall understanding of that issue, then by all means feel free to share them with us. Just call the 800 number, 844-THE-HORN. And if you dial that number, 844-THE-HORN, you'll be into the studios, and Bob will connect you immediately, and you'll be on the air. I just want you to know that you are welcome. Please don't feel that because there's a program underway that you would be interfering or changing the subject or anything else. Believe me, you will not be. One additional thing on that topic that we closed the first hour with, on the Commission on Unalienable Rights. I made reference to it, but a couple of people have commented that the State Department's use of language like natural law and natural rights seems to them to point to a religious interpretation of rights. One of them, one commentator made the point and said, this term is a code religious conservatives often use to impose their religious beliefs about women and LGBTQ people in some sort of non-religious disguise. Jeremy Caden, who is an international policy advocate for the Human Rights Commission, pointed to the same thing in a statement to CNN. He said, quote, this is an attempt to pull back a U.S. human rights vision that we've had for decades and create a new vision that uses these new terms, like unalienable rights or natural law. These are all things that have been used by extremist people on the far right in an effort to create a gap between what they consider unalienable rights and alienable rights. One of the rights, and we talked a little bit about women's rights, Hillary Clinton's statement in the 2016 campaign about women's rights being human rights, deals with the issue of reproductive rights. And I think it's very significant that the chairman of this commission, the chairperson of this commission, Mary Glendon, has written and spoken extensively against abortion and in opposition to the idea of reproductive rights for women. In fact, there's a record of this. A woman named Francoise Girard, I guess Francoise Girard may be male. I don't know if it's a woman. But I gather it's a woman because she's president of the International Women's Health Coalition. But anyway, she said that Glendon, Mary Ann Glendon, has been associated with the Vatican for quite a while. And at a 1995 United Nations World Conference on Women held in Beijing, China, Girard said that Glendon objected strenuously on behalf of the church to the use of words like reproductive rights and any mention of abortion at all. as part of this United Nations World Conference on Women. So the fact that she's appointed to chair this commission, it seems to me, raises serious questions about it. At minimum, it kind of signals the ideological bent that this commission is going to be taking. And when you realize that it's human rights that are on the table, one has to believe that this is going to turn out, or the implication is that it's going to turn out, for most people, worse than chances are worse rather than better. So I think it's important. I think it's worthy of something we ought to keep an eye on. I wanted in this second hour to revisit the issue that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks. And this is this whole idea of the way we teach American history as introduced by Jill Lepore of Harvard. And as specifically, the source I'm dealing with here is an article that Jill Lepore wrote in Foreign Affairs in the March-April edition 2019, entitled The New Americanism, Why a Nation Needs a National History. And I've talked about this before on two occasions when I was going to get into this article, but we never got there. And so I wanted to make an effort to get into it today with the idea that we could, undoubtedly it'll go beyond today, that we can extend this and continue it into tomorrow, because I think it's very important. So let me go back and mention again a few of the things that I mentioned before. And that is that, and this is Lepore speaking, in 1986, in an address to the American Historical Association, Carl Degler, American historian, Stanford historian, that I know very well, Jill Lepore refers to him as a gentle, quiet, heroic man, accused his colleagues, American historians, of nothing short of dereliction of duty. Appalled by nationalism, they had abandoned the study of the nation. And this is what Degler said, quote, "We can write history that implicitly denies or ignores the nation state, but it would be a history that flew in the face of what people who live in a nation state require and demand." Degler issued a warning. If we historians fail to provide a nationally defined history, others less critical and less informed will take over the job for us, unquote. And that's the lead-in to Jill Lepore's thinking on this issue of teaching the history of the nation. She credits Degler with writing the last real history of this nation until she took on the challenge and published her book. I think it's called These Truths. It's a monumental study, about 1,000 pages, that I believe came out last year. And basically, it's tied to the idea that two things have happened, and I mentioned this before. Two things have happened in the study of history since the 70s. And one or the other seems to be going on. Either the move is away from Western civilization toward more global history, world history, or it goes in the other direction, and American history, instead of becoming traditional American history, becomes studying particular facets of that story, like civil rights, women's history, legal history, something like that. And again, as she says, as Jill Lepore says, There's nothing wrong with this because it contributes to good history. But the fact of the matter is, if you stop writing about the history of the nation, there's a loss to that, a real loss. And according to her, and it makes perfect sense, what prompted these shifts in the teaching of history was the fear of nationalism. Because nationalism in the early 20th century had been the cause of both world wars. It led to Hitler's rise in Germany, Mussolini's in Italy, the military's rise to power in Japan. In other words, the evils and the dangers and the extremes of nationalism basically became a factor. And she says that rise of nationalism created fear on the part of historians. They were so alienated, so anti-nationalism, so offended by nationalism, that they didn't want to write any history which even smacked of appearing to be nationalism. In 1989, and I think I've mentioned this a few times before on this program, a political scientist named Francis Fukuyama, not a historian, wrote an essay in 1989 entitled The End of History. And basically what he was talking about is exactly what Degler said in 1986 to the American Historical Association. In 1989, Fukuyama pointed out, fascism is dead. Communism is dead. And all of this, of course, is at the end of the Cold War. According to Fukuyama, nationalism, the greatest remaining threat to liberalism, had been, according to Fukuyama, defanged in the West. And in other parts of the world, it had taken a beating as well. Quote of Fukuyama, the vast majority of the world's nationalist movements do not have a political program beyond the negative desire of independence from some other group of people, and do not offer anything like a comprehensive agenda for socio-economic organization, Fukuyama wrote. Basically, what we're seeing now is a rebirth of nationalism. And I can remember President Trump at one of his rallies talking about his commitment to nationalism and bragging about the fact that we're afraid to use that word. And President Trump said, I'm a nationalist. I'm a nationalist. I'm proud of it. And so basically, that's really what began to happen. And what Jill Lepore does is go all the way back to the beginning and talking about the emergence of American history teaching and writing as a discipline. And she points out that every nation needs to tell its story, to write its history. So if you go all the way back in the history of this nation, you can begin to see that beginning in the 1930s, George Bancroft began to write his history of the United States. As one historian, Thomas Bender, once observed, nations are, among other things, a collective agreement, partly coerced, to affirm a common history as the basis for a shared future. All of this began to change in the 1970s. Jill Lepore says, quote, when historians abandon the study of the nation, when scholars stop trying to write a common history for a people, nationalism doesn't die. Instead, it eats liberalism. And then she goes back into the difference between the United States and other nation states. And she points out that when the United States came into existence, when the United States declared its independence in 1776, it became a state, but it wasn't yet a nation. And she said the fact that people shared a common ancestry, a common background, a common culture was a myth. It was a fiction. People came from all over. And with independence, the last thing people wanted to do was talk about the fact that they were British, or that everything about them was something that they were indebted to the British for. We were a confederation of states, and that's what the national government as such was called in the 1780s, the Articles of Confederation. It was a union, a league of friendship between states, but there was nothing that remotely resembled a nation. In fact, many of the founders were afraid that the nation could not survive because there was so much competition, rivalry, and hostility between the states themselves. In Federalist number 2 of the Federalist Papers, John Jay, and we don't quote him too much, he wrote the first 4 or 5 Federalist Papers. John Jay, in Federalist number 2, talked about the following: Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. Jill Lepore says, he was whistling in the dark. This country was anything but that. It was diverse. It was multicultural. It was multiracial. It had numerous religious denominations. It wasn't one people at all. And her point is, the only way that this state became a nation was when people began to see themselves or think of themselves as belonging to a nation. And the writing of the nation's story, history, is what does that. David Armitage, an American historian, suggested that the United States is really quite different than a nation state. And this is a quote from David Armitage. What we mean by nationalism is the desire of nations, however defined, to possess states, to create a peculiar hybrid we call the nation state. But there's also a beast that we might call the state nation, which arises when the state is formed before the development of a sense of national consciousness. The United States should be seen as perhaps the only spectacular example of the latter, not a nation state, but a state nation. We were a state first, and we had to become a nation. And part of that becoming was to develop a national sense of unity. the fact that we belong to the same nation, all of us. And what breeds that is the writing of the nation's history. And so basically, this gets us to Bancroft. Bancroft published a 10-volume history of the United States entitled From the Discovery of the American Continent. These 10 volumes were published between 1834 and 1874. That's 40 years, a 40-year project. And it was picked up after that by other historians. Bancroft de-emphasized the British inheritance. And he talked about the fact that the United States was something different, something inevitable, that its growth was unlimited. And he began to celebrate the United States as a pluralistic, cosmopolitan nation with ancestors all over the world. In other words, we were unique by what we had together, what we all shared together. But what we shared together is not what most nations share together, which is a common past, a common culture, a common race, a common religion, etc. In those, we were diverse. But what we shared in common were the values, the Enlightenment values, upon which this nation was based. And that ultimately meant that the American nation defined itself as something quite different than other nations, because the makeup of our nationalism, as so-called, was different. In 1849, 11 years before the Civil War, Charles Sumner, who would be senator from Massachusetts after the war, wrote the following: "Here is the great charter of every human being, drawing vital breath upon this soil, whatever may be his condition, whoever may be his parents. He may be poor, weak, humble, or black. He may be of Caucasian, Jewish, Indian, or Ethiopian race. He may be of French, German, English, or Irish extraction. But before the Constitution of Massachusetts, all of these distinctions disappear. He's a man, the equal of all his other fellow men. He's one of the children of the state, which, like an impartial parent, regards all of its offspring with an equal care." In other words, this state became a nation with common values. And it's those values that ultimately began to define this nation and to comprise the story of the nation that we read in history books for the longest time. And that's the theme that we began to surrender in the 1970s. Prior to the Civil War, Northerners especially, and this is Jill Lepore speaking, drew a contrast between Northern nationalism and Southern sectionalism. This is a quote from a congressman from Michigan in 1850. "We must cultivate a national instead of a sectional patriotism," he said. Lepore points out that Southerners were nationalists also. It's just that their nationalism was not liberal like ours. It was ethnic and illiberal. And it opposed Northerners' liberal civic nationalism. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Ours is a government of white men. He declared in 1848, arguing that we never wanted to admit Mexicans as citizens. This government was made by our fathers on the white basis, Stephen Douglas said in 1858 in his debates with Lincoln. It was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, unquote. So that's the issue. Northern nationalism, Southern sectionalism can really be looked at as two competing definitions of nationalism. The Northern version and the Southern version. Abraham Lincoln took up the gauntlet in his debates with Douglas. In 1858, in Galesburg, Illinois, Lincoln said the following: I believe that the entire records of the world, from the date of the Declaration of Independence up to within 3 years ago, may be searched in vain for one single affirmation, one single man, that the Negro was not included in the Declaration of Independence. I think I may defy Judge Douglas to show that he ever said so, that Washington ever said so, that any president ever said so, that any member of Congress ever said so, or any living man upon the whole earth ever said so, until the necessities of the present policy of the Democratic Party in regard to slavery had to invent that affirmation, unquote. What Lincoln is saying is that throughout the nation's history, the Declaration of Independence always applied to black people, and that nobody ever spoke and said it didn't. Until now, Lincoln said. Until the South needed to redefine its version of nationalism in order to separate itself from the multiracial, multi-ethnic North. And that's really, it seems to me, the issue. Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy in 1861, delivered a very famous speech in Savannah, in which he talked about the ideas that lay behind the United States Constitution. He said the U.S. Constitution rested upon the assumption of the equality of the races. In other words, he's conceding Lincoln's argument. And then he drew a distinction between that and the Confederacy. Our new government, he said, is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and moral condition. So up until the Civil War, that's the issue. Basically, the idea of individual freedom, the idea of government responsibility and accountability, the idea of mass participation, the idea of the freedoms articulated in the Bill of Rights and elsewhere, freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, etc., the right to a jury trial, and all the rest of it, the rights spelled out, ultimately these became the ingredients of what becomes American nationalism at the time. The competing versions of nationalism between North and South are pretty much based on the issue of slavery. The South needs to exclude black people from the constitutional frame of government that it creates. And so ultimately, it comes up with an alternative or competing definition of nationalism. After the war, during the period that we call Reconstruction, the nation began to reorganize itself around the version of nationalism that existed prior to the war only in the North. The South had been defeated. That means that its version of nationalism based on race was defeated. And leaders began to speak of the idea of the United States as something uniquely different. Frederick Douglass delivered, and Jill Lepore says this, and I think I agree with her because I've read the speech, delivered one of the most important, least read speeches in American political history in 1869. In urging for the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments and establishing what he called a composite nation. And this is what he said in this speech. On the question of whether we are the better or worse for being composed of different races of people, he's talking, that essentially is what he's talking about. Douglass said, I want a home here, not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but I want the Asiatic to find a home here in the United States as well. I want them to feel at home here, both for their sake and for ours. We shall be what Douglass called a composite nation. We shall spread the language of our science and civilization over all who seek their shelter, whether from Asia, Africa, or the isles of the sea. All shall here bow to the same law, speak the same language, support the same government, enjoy the same liberty, vibrate with the same national enthusiasm, and seek the same national ends. This Douglass called a new Americanism. It didn't last. The major change on the issue of nationalism that occurred in our history occurred with Reconstruction in the late 19th century. As even after the war ended, there was hostility between the races. And one by one, the Reconstruction governments in the South began to fall, and power began to return to the white democratic power structure that held it before the war. So ultimately, it was the pressure of the so-called liberal Republicans after the war that came up with the idea of Reconstruction, and the fact that the Republican Party would guarantee rights, the right to vote, etc., to the ex-slaves, and basically had to occupy, these were the Reconstruction Acts, ended up occupying the South militarily under martial law in order to stem the violence and to guarantee the political rights. of freed blacks. But gradually, as the 60s moved into the 1870s, many people began to become disenchanted with the racial violence existing in the South. Why? Why did the taxpayers have to continue to support military troops in southern states in order to keep the races from killing each other? When is this going to end? Many people began to believe. What was the Civil War about? A major factor in this disenchantment came from northern business, because with the end of the Civil War in the South emerged a tremendous investment opportunity to rebuild the South. Railroads, buildings, waterways, harbors. There was tremendous money to be made in the rebuilding of the South. But none of it could reach fruition. None of it could happen as long as racial tension and racial violence continued there. So people in the North began to become disenchanted with Reconstruction, disenchanted with the federal government protection of the rights of freed blacks. And one by one, the Reconstruction states in the South began to fall back into the hands of corporate middle-class investor types in the South, who were more than willing to work with northern investors in order to essentially regain control over what Southerners called their own social circumstances. In other words, we want back control over our own states. And I'll finish with this, because we've got about 6-7 minutes left in today's program. This is a story that I used to tell teaching history all the time. Students used to really get off on this particular story, because it's quite a story. In the election of 1876 for president, there was a Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden, and a Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. When the polls closed and the votes were counted, Tilden had 184 electoral votes. He needed 185. He needed one more vote. The election results in 3 states, three southern states, were disputed. Two sets of election returns were submitted, one from each side, one from the Democrats, one from the Republicans, because of the voting irregularities in the election in these 3 states: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. So nobody knew who the president was, but there were challenged votes in 3 states, and Tilden only needed one more electoral vote to win the presidency. The situation was ripe for a political deal, for a bargain. And the bargain happened in January 1877. In 1877, Congress created what it claimed was a neutral, objective commission to resolve the election and reach a result in order to give the American people, in order to tell the American people who had won the election, who the President of the United States was. The Electoral Commission created by Congress in January 1877 consisted of 5 representatives from the House of Representatives, 5 senators, and 5 Supreme Court justices. The commission's members included 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent justice, David Davis. Davis refused to serve, and the moderate Republican justice, Joseph Bradley, was chosen to replace him. So with the addition of Joseph Bradley to the commission, it was now an 8-7 Republican commission. In February, a meeting was held at the Wormley Hotel in Washington, D.C. And in that meeting, a deal was struck between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats agreed to a Hayes victory, in other words, throwing the rest of the electoral votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, and to respect the civil political rights of African Americans on the condition that Republicans withdraw all federal troops from the South, as well as providing federal aid to support the construction of a Texas Pacific Railroad running from the east to the west on a southern route in order to expedite the growth of the South. So on March 2nd, as a result of that deal cut at the Wormley Hotel, the commission announced that the disputed electoral votes had all gone to Rutherford B. Hayes, and that the Republicans had won the election 185 to Tilden's 184. And that was the end of Reconstruction. And that was the beginning of the so-called New South. A New South in which power was back in Southern hands, the federal troops were gone, and that was the beginning of a segregated South. The South was given the freedom to solve its own racial tensions and problems. In other words, when Reconstruction ended in the South, nationalism was to be defined the way it was defined by Southern leaders before the war. And blacks were on the receiving end of the stick. And nationalism was defined especially on the basis of race. And we know what happened with all of it right up into the 1930s with the rise of Hitler, Mussolini in the 20s, Japan, the military power in Japan, the World War, and all of it. All of that constituted the background to the writing of American history. Consequently, the publication of Carl Dagler's book, Out of Our Past, in the early 70s, was, according to Jill Lepore, the last national history of the United States until her book, These Truths, came out earlier this year. There's way more to this story than this, but unfortunately there's not way more time. We have less than 1 minute left in today's program. So let me once again thank Bob and Agnes and the Head On Radio folks for continuing to support the program. But most important, let me thank you, the listener, for continuing to support the network and continuing to support this program. I appreciate it. I remind you that tomorrow is the Mueller testimony. I expect to be watching it as much as I can until we come on the air at 1 o'clock. But we will have our regular program, because I'm sure that even though the Mueller testimony ends in the afternoon, there'll be enough coverage that we'll be able to, and I'll be able to, pick up what I missed while we're on the air. So again, I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I look forward to being with you again as we continue what I think is an absolutely incredibly important story. So thank you. Enjoy each other. Have a wonderful evening. Be back tomorrow. Thank you.